I did just get these through the post.
Oh, is it a coaster?
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very exciting.
Those look well made.
Yeah. So get your Bread and Rosaries coasters at our shop.
Hey, that's good advertising, that is.
Just plugging that there, yeah.
Adam's house is now mostly Bread and Rosaries themed merch, isn't it, at this point? Like?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. There's no fucker will buy it. breadandrosaries.com.
Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, a leftist Christian podcast. I'm Ben Molyneux-Hetherington and I'm joined by Adam Spears. Hello, Adam.
A leftist Christian podcast. That is the weakest one you've had yet.
It's because I just realised that I was midway through trying to think of something to write. And as well, the worst thing is that we usually say the, because, you know, we don't want to acknowledge the other ones.
Yeah, there are others.
We are still short a Johnny and a Lou, who are both off living their best August holiday lives. But we are joined this week by Dr. Dan McClellan. I have got something that Adam has written here that says you are a TikToker, podcaster, biblical scholar, and wearer of excellent T-shirts. Is this a TikTok thing that I've missed?
So yeah, when I'm not required to wear a tie, I am in a T-shirt, and I prefer graphic tees. And on TikTok, as I started to gain some attention, I got a lot of comments about comic book T-shirts that I would wear, and so that's become part of my brand now. I consider that my work uniform, and so whenever I get the urge, I'll buy a handful of T-shirts, and it all goes on my business card because that's for work. So
yeah, of course.
Oh my goodness, that we are missing a trick there.
So, Dan, do you want to tell us a little bit? Obviously, people have now picked up that you're a TikTok. I don't want to call you a TikTok celebrity. That feels wrong. But you're someone with prominence. But you have other jobs as well, I believe.
Not really. Since I used to, for 10 years, I was a scripture translation supervisor for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so the LDS, the Mormon Church. And I got into TikTok in 2021 during the pandemic and was starting to monetize on that platform. I started teaching online classes, which was also going very well. And I started to make more money on social media than I was getting in my paycheck almost a year ago. And so in January, I left my full-time employment and I've just been doing this full-time. And so I still don't feel like I have a job. I just kind of dick around on the internet. So, but it's been very successful to this point. So yeah, I call myself a public scholar of the Bible and religion, and the different channels are our social media: TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, places like that. And then I also do online classes, and then I also have the podcast, and I am also starting a book. A trade book right now on misunderstandings about what the Bible does and does not, quote unquote, say.
Which I can imagine is not there's a lot of options there, right? To plenty of misunderstandings to tackle.
Yeah, and it's going to be a very tricky kind of balancing act, because I've got to try to address some complex issues, but my mandate is to do this in a very, very accessible way, so that this is a book that can be accessed by a very general audience.
But to be fair, I think as well, you've got your practice in on kind of tackling those difficult issues for a general audience in your podcast. You host a podcast with another Dan called Data Over Dogma. I have to admit that when I first heard of it, I think Adam said it to me, I was like, I'm not sure about this. And so I want to set other people at ease. When they say data, it's not numbers, because that was my concern. I was like, oh no, I'm so confused by maths. This is not. But it's a really brilliant, I think it's really accessible. And I definitely found that as someone that is, I've done a bit of theology, and there's lots of stuff that I'm going, I never even learned that or never considered that, but in a way that, is accessible. You don't have to have a PhD or anything like that to wrap your head around it, but it's good quality scholarship in an accessible way, which is not easy to find always. So yeah, I recommend it for sure.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm glad to hear it's coming through in an accessible way. We would be significantly limiting our audience if a prerequisite were having a PhD.
Yes.
And that would be a problematic thing to do. I was, my co-host and I were actually at a podcasting convention last week in Denver, Colorado. And I had maybe 30 to 40 people recognize me and come up and say hi. And it was a little embarrassing because they'd say, "Oh, I love your work on TikTok or Instagram or whatever." And then my co-host would lean in and say, "Did you know he has a podcast?" And they would say, "No, I didn't know that." And he would kind of give me the side eye because I'm evidently awful at promoting our podcast. So anyway, that's the Data Over Dogma podcast. Which you can find
that's good.
dataoverdogmapod.com or youtube.com/@ Data Over Dogma. So check it out. We have hour-long episodes that come out every Monday. And we're actually working on joining a network. So I don't know if y'all are still independent podcasters, but we're going to see if
very much so. Yeah,
yeah. Not necessarily by our choice, but
that's I didn't even know that networking was a thing. But we went to this conference, and I was like, more people are doing this than I thought, and there's money in this. So. Yeah. So we're probably going to be doing that shortly, which will hopefully expand the reach of our podcast and hopefully help a lot more people who could use these kinds of data, this kind of information in their negotiating with their traditions, whether they're deconstructing, reconstructing, carrying on as usual, or whatever.
So, we are going to talk about some stuff today that is particularly... I know.
I didn't agree to this. All right.
Particularly about kind of constructions of Jesus. So I think we are going to get into some proper theology. So I might start getting out of my depth a little bit, but I'm hoping the pair of you can guide us through some of that. And there's a word as well that we're going to get to that you use a lot on the Data Over Dogma podcast, and I think it's just a fantastic word, which is univocality.
Ah, yes.
Oh, such a good word. I've been trying to use it in my everyday life without a lot of success, but it's, that's my little tease. We will get on to talking a little bit about univocality.
All right.
But first, we're going to start with our usual segment, What Else Is On My Mind Grapes?
What else is on my mind, grapes?
Adam, I think you sent across something to me about the wonderful nation of France. We're going all over the world. We've got American, we've got French.
That's hardly all over the world. I mean, as long as we keep it in the global north.
Obviously.
Yeah, so I think I sent you a thing, talk about how France is banning, I don't even know how to say it, is abayas?
There's a reason that I threw to you to say this bit, and that's 100% because I wasn't sure. I would guess a bias, but it might be abayas, yeah.
Well, whatever they are loose-fitting, full-length robes that are worn by some Muslim women, right? And France has a history of banning anything it kind of sees as, I'm not going to say religious. I mean, to some extent, yes, but particularly Muslim.
Yes.
Right? And I thought this was a really interesting thing because obviously there's an inherent Islamophobia to a lot of this stuff that's going on, banning burqas and even burkinis on the beach. But also there's an important thing to think about different models of secularism, because when we talk about secularism in the UK, we're often talking about a model of secularism that argues that people should be given, or ideas should be given, sort of equal space and time, that people should be allowed to express themselves however they choose. Whereas in France, it's a slightly different model of secularism that's obviously sort of grown partly out of the Enlightenment, but out of the sort of French Revolution as well, where things are a little bit more direct, shall we say. And I've sort of watched France doing this kind of thing for some years now and sort of thought, goodness. And there are, of course, people in this country who very much would like to go the same way. And I think actually we need to be very careful about that, because you just end up with these awful scenes like we saw a few years ago, where there's a policeman harassing some poor woman on a beach somewhere because she dares to wear a burkini.
Yeah, it's not a great state of affairs. And as you kind of mentioned, the conception of secularism there is definitely an anti-Islam, particularly, not just, they obviously don't, allow religious aspects. And obviously we, here in the UK, we're still, we still have an established church and all that malarkey. So technically speaking,
not for long.
Yes, fingers crossed there, Adam. But yeah, we don't have secularism technically in this country. But obviously there's quite a different model over where you are, Dan, where obviously religious fundamentalism has continued to be an issue, but it's, quite a different role that kind of plays in the American context.
Yeah, it's an issue. I don't know why our country needs to be the kind of juvenile brat that refuses to grow up when it comes to a lot of these things. And we don't have a formally established church, but the reality is that Protestant Christianity is baked into the foundations of so much of what we do, and a lot of the systemic power asymmetries that were written into our Constitution and the way things have taken shape in our country continue to cause all kinds of issues, continue to funnel power to certain groups and certain members of those groups over and against the interests of others. And we've created our own little kind of caste system over here that is informal and kind of rides under the radar to some degree, so that it's more subtle and a lot more easily dismissed by folks who benefit from it, and so are not incentivized to think critically about it. And that is a huge issue. There was and particularly when it comes to questions of race and things like that, there was a wonderful book that was written a short time ago called The Bible Tells Them So, which is about evangelicals in the South and the use of the Bible to defend and reinforce and perpetuate racial inequalities. And that's today, I think it's one of the most pernicious kind of cancers of our society on this side of the Atlantic that we refuse to think critically about and refuse to root out of our society. And there are a lot of us who are working hard to try to raise awareness of that, but it's challenging the power structures, which makes it something that is going to just be intuitively averse to a lot of people who are benefiting from those structures.
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St. George's College in Jerusalem, says, I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering. To find details of local actions or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
And I do find the comparison fascinating in terms of, over here, I mean, not that long ago, we had the coronation of the king, which is a very explicitly Christian. Oh, yeah. What is it that you'd like me to call him? Charles Windsor.
Is it Charles Windsor? Yeah.
Yeah, but, that's a very explicitly Christian thing, even if Charles Windsor himself is apparently a little bit uncomfortable with that aspect of it. But, and there's almost like it's so big and obvious and in your face, the kind of inbuilt Christian bias in the society that it then just becomes part of the background noise and people don't really notice it. And yet you've almost got the polar opposite, in the States, but ultimately you end up in the same place where certain groups and religious beliefs are prioritized and, given a much larger say in things than others, even though they're kind of very different ways of approaching that, you end in the same place.
Yeah, it's such a huge problem. And one of the things that I see is kind of obstructing attempts to overcome this is this idea that like in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, that it is unbiased and is intended to apply equally. And when you have systemic power asymmetries, like that doesn't help that. That's just allowing the system to perpetuate itself. And one of the things I find just so aggravating is one of my state senators is fond of talking about how the Constitution protects minorities, but ignores the fact that when they talked about the minority in the founding period, they were talking about the wealthy because they were protecting themselves as and this is word for word how James Madison referred to himself, as the minority of the opulent. So when they talk about protecting the minority, it was, we don't want a democracy with a bunch of the riffraff hurting our investments and our money. And so we want to protect the minority, meaning the wealthiest people in our country, namely us. And so now we have a lot of politicians, particularly some of my state legislators, as well as at least one of our U.S. senators who suggest that means the Constitution already protects like ethnic minorities and folks like that when they are going well out of their way to try to oppress ethnic minorities and other types of minorities that we have in this system.
It speaks to that kind of thing that we always see where kind of liberal approaches to this kind of thing always end up kind of upholding the status quo, rather than like they will have the fight on the terms that the conservatives set. Rather than saying, well, perhaps we need to take a step back and look at how foundational these issues are.
Yeah. And I think that's because a lot of the people on all sides of this question, to the degree that there are institutions involved in this, and in the U.S. we have a two-party system, and so the two big institutions are the Republicans and the Democrats. And the folks who are pulling levers in the Democratic Party are just as invested in the system as the folks who are pulling the levers on the other side. And so dismantling the whole system is just as much a threat to their livelihood and their worldview as it is to the conservatives. And so, it's an attempt to kind of there's incrementalism is a priority for a lot of folks who would call themselves liberal in our country. This idea that we just have to kind of piece by piece move towards something within the system. And the reality is, we didn't get rid of slavery through incrementalism. It took the bloodiest war that our nation had ever seen before and has ever seen since in order to completely obliterate the system. And then we really kind of reestablished almost the same system. because of how many people had interests in that system. And so revolution is really the only thing that can change something like this. And I find it just so bizarre that particularly in our nation, we have people who literally deify the American Revolution and the folks who appealed to certain what they considered natural rights, such as the right to violence, if their rights are being denied and there is no other recourse, and turn around and say people whose very lives are being devalued by the state don't have a right to violence because that would be too upsetting. And that would disrupt the apple cart, and it's so hypocritical to champion a revolution ginned up by some rich white men who did not want to give away any more of their money, while at the same time demonizing ethnic minorities who are saying, "Stop killing us indiscriminately."
Yeah.
Something that I get a lot, particularly on Twitter, is folks saying, "Oh, you think everything's about power structures, therefore I will dismiss everything that you have to say." And it's just baffling.
Yeah.
How oblivious folks are and being like, "Don't touch my power structures. There's no such thing as power structures. How dare you say there are power structures? Stay away from my power structures." Oh, it's so aggravating.
You got to be careful, Dan. You're starting to sound like one of those lefty woke academics that are destroying the country. You got to be careful.
Well, if the right doesn't have a boogeyman, then they've got no reason to exist.
Yeah.
So I will fill that role if needs be.
I also thought, by the way, that Minority of the Opulent would make a great progressive metal album title. I don't think that's... I would listen to that. It's got a great cover, that vinyl, I'm sure. Shall we move on to our main topic today and talk a little bit about Jesus? That's right, we are kind of a Christian podcast, believe it or not. Adam, I think you wanted to start by getting everyone to talk a little bit about their kind of personal construction of Jesus. So you've had time to think about that, so I'm going to make you start.
I thought you might. Yeah. Cool. So my idea for this was basically that we kind of just need to own our biases. So I just wanted to just lay out how I kind of see Jesus, how I construct him in my head. And then, Ben, you can do the same. And then Dan can tell us why I'm right. So, yeah, I'll start by saying that I do construct a very left-wing Jesus in my head. And I recognize that, we're talking about someone who lived in a culture completely alien to ours 2,000 years ago. So I say all of this with that caveat, and I still don't care. So for me, I think when you look at Jesus' emphasis on caring for the marginalized, the orphan, the widow, I think he always seems to prioritize this group and use that phrase as a way to talk about a group that I think he has, in a sense, constructed himself and how we should approach those people. And then sort of on top of that, when he meets with those that really have sort of institutional power, he's often quite dismissive and sometimes quite denigrating to them. Think about, calling Herod a fox, which I think we've spoken about before, Ben, and you thought that Jesus was saying that Herod was kind of foxy. I don't think that was what he was going for.
That'd be an example of eisegesis, would it?
I think it would. Yeah, and I think you see this kind of fairly anti-imperial message as well. At the very least, this is how the Gospels, particularly Gospel of Luke, constructs Jesus from the beginning. And, you look at things like the Magnificat, where whether or not Mary literally sang this song, it's constructed in such a way as to show Jesus in opposition to and as someone who's tearing down those empires and those rulers from their thrones. So for me, I see a sort of fairly consistently left wing, in our sort of modern terms, anti-imperial approach. and arguably anti-state as well. I'm going to throw that in just for you, Ben.
There's the anarchist in you coming out.
Yeah. There are anarchists in the Church of England, okay?
And they're confused about whether they really belong there and are not sure it fits them, so they are classic members of the Church of England.
Yeah, exactly. Right. In some ways, you can't get more C of E than an anarchist Anglican, can you? Yeah. So I think when you look at some of the stuff he says about paying your taxes to Caesar, people often interpret that in a Jesus saying, well, you should pay your taxes then. And actually, what's really going on there is he's being ironic in that moment and using that coin to kind of denigrate that power and all that goes into that. So I'd say that's anti-imperial, but I would argue quite kind of anti-state as well. So I guess, there's a lot more you could say, but I'll leave it there so that Ben's got something to cling to.
I don't know. I was thinking about this, and what I realised quite quickly is that I don't know if I have a particularly concrete concept. There's lots of things at this point in my faith where there's a certain bliss in fuzziness, in not nailing my colours.
You're starting to sound like Johnny. You're going to be quoting Foucault before long, aren't you?
Well, yeah. Do you know what? I was thinking this is going to be a bit. If yours was a bit anarchist for my taste, mine's going to be a bit postmodern for your taste. That's But what I was thinking about is actually how my conception of Jesus is very much a reaction. Listeners will know this because we talk about it fairly often. But I'm, I was brought up in conservative evangelicalism and left that space as kind of a late teens, early 20s. And therefore, I think to some extent, I still find myself, there are things I hear and have a really strong reaction to it. And then I have to pause and be like, that's just because it sounded vaguely like something that you heard in your childhood. And therefore you're like, no, that must be bad. And I think that is for me, actually I think about so much of my conception of Jesus. I mean, I'll shock people here. I have not just walked over to get to the Bible on my shelf, read through the Gospels, and emerged with the correct and the perfect conception of Jesus, right?
Well, see, this is the thing, Ben. If you had done that, if you'd really put your trust in the Lord, and you'd read the Bible cover to cover, you would have met with the Lord, and you'd be a conservative evangelical.
But, I am essentially a cradle Christian. Technically, I think I was 2 or whatever, but I don't remember not being in church. And so my conception of Jesus, I didn't start from nothing, right? I started from this point, and where I've ended up is completely different from that, but it is all very traceable back to that. And a lot of it is even a reaction against that. But then you could probably go even further than that because, that evangelical church, some of their conception of who Jesus is a response to other things that they didn't like, and therefore their Jesus is in opposition to that, and my Jesus is in opposition to them.
And really, you've now become evangelical about being anti-evangelical.
Yeah. and this is where fuzziness is nice, because I then can just stop thinking about these things a bit. But yeah, and I think particularly for me, I am very extremely fuzzy on the relationship between the historical person of Jesus and what I believe kind of theologically. I would like to think there's some sort of link there, but I'm also very aware that even if we accept the Gospels as an accurate historical record, which we definitely don't, but even if we take...
raising the heresy here and there.
But, even if we, leave aside the inherent contradictions within the Gospels and all that sort of stuff, I still, I'm not the intended audience of those. I live in a completely different cultural world with a different language, so... But at the same time, I do cling to some sense that there is some relationship between how I would conceive of Jesus and a historical figure and a historical Christianity. And that might just be, I don't know, what's the word? There might just be cognitive dissonance, I might just be contradicting myself, but I'm also quite happy. If I don't think about it too much deeper, I don't have to get sad about it. So I think for me it's a very fuzzy, complicated picture, but I was definitely thinking about the way everything exists in reaction or relationship to what comes before. There is no pure, clean starting point for how I would conceive of Jesus.
That's very Marxist, very dialectical, to be fair. So,
you're okay with it then?
Yeah, most of it.
I think there are a lot of things to consider here. One is that I think it's absolutely true that everything is contextual. We don't have anything that is transcending the vicissitudes of the power structures and the different social identities and their conflicts. Those things are involved in every representation of Jesus, whether it is the representation we find in the Gospels and in the rest of the New Testament, or the representation that we generate today. And, when we look at the Gospels, we're looking at representations by individual authors or groups of authors, and they differ. And so just to try to come up with a single Jesus, we have to negotiate with the different gospel authors. Although I think some things that are pretty consistent across the board are that Jesus was pushing back against certain types of power, and particularly state and imperial power. And I think that's also a reaction.
Ben. That's 1-0, mate.
But I think that's also a reaction. When we look in the Hebrew Bible, I think we see Jesus is appealing to the prophetic critique quite a bit. And this is the prophets of the 8th century who are condemning a lot of the trappings of wealth and a lot of the manipulations of the market and the courts and things like that were going on during a period of exponential growth within both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, who were ruled by kings who had like 40 to 50 year reigns. And like this was the most successful time period in the history of that part of the world, in the ancient world. And the prophets came out of the woodwork saying, y'all are violating, just the fundamental pro-social principles that hold our state together. And that gets picked up by Jesus, as well as the anti-imperialism that I would suggest is a reaction to exile by Babylon, by significant oppression during the Hellenistic period under the Seleucid and even the Ptolemaic empires, and then by Rome. And so all of this is also contextual. And so Jesus is representing this kind of raising the fist against empire and the people who have us under their boot. And so I think we can see a Jesus who is opposed to that, but at the same time is also operating within the frameworks established by Greco-Roman period Judaism, which in a lot of ways are still conservative in some ways and radical in other ways, just because they were responding to a lot of the Greco-Roman philosophical trends that were going on at the time. And so some of the movements, for instance, at Qumran and elsewhere, were quite conservative when it comes to sexual politics and the family and things like that. It's nowhere in the New Testament, but at Qumran, you seem to have a condemnation of things like polygamy. And within Greco-Roman period Judaism, there is a lot more conservative sexual ethic taking place, and you see it bubbling to the surface most clearly in Paul. But even within the Gospel of Matthew, you have this reference to when they're talking about divorce, and Jesus's disciples say, well, then it's just better if a person doesn't get married at all. And Jesus is kind of like on the nosy, saying, this is a hard saying. Some people are born eunuchs, some people are made eunuchs by others. Some people make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And then again, he's kind of like, this is not for everybody, but, the ones who live the higher law are going to be chaste throughout their entire lives. And that celibacy is what Paul picks up as well. And so I think there are, it's not going to line up perfectly with how our society is structured or how it's operating today. But I think we see some ideologies in the New Testament that would align with leftist ideologies today. But there is also some conservatism that I think would rub leftists the wrong way today. I would argue that is just a symptom of the fact that we live in two entirely different worlds. And so we can't expect everything to shake out into the exact same basket. It's going to be a mixed bag. But I would agree that it's largely pushing back against oppressive power structures. That I think is consistent throughout the New Testament, even if the power structures are very different today than they were anciently. And now the Christians are the ones who are largely in charge of the power structures, at least in societies that are descended from the intellectual history of Europe.
And I think there's something quite particularly for us in the kind of British context where we want to see ourselves in Jesus and in ancient Israel and all that sort of stuff. But particularly for us, it wasn't that long ago we had a whole empire, which kind of makes us the bad guys in the Bible. And obviously those are not direct lines. And, those ideas about empire, particularly, I must say, for older people who maybe can remember or have, only one generation removed from having an empire. Mm-hmm. I think for everyone, the kind of ideas and language of empire is so central but unspoken to British culture that I actually think it adds a real difficulty to engaging and, certainly in terms of pulling out contemporary kind of relevance to some of those ideas. We are on the wrong side of the Bible, I think.
I taught an online class on Revelation recently, and looking in early Christianity, it was so fascinating. In the earliest periods, it was like, oh yeah, the beast is Rome and Nero and the Roman Empire, and empire is bad. And then Christianity took over the Roman Empire. And then everybody was kind of like, what do we do with this now? And so it was, people were kind of confused about Revelation. And at this time, it still had not really become canon. And then we had folks like Athanasius who used the book of Revelation to condemn the kind of lukewarm Christians. It was like, you got to be orthodox to your core or you are following after the beast. And then Augustine was like, oh, it's all been fulfilled because everything has been overturned and we are now in charge. So book of Revelation, done and dusted. It's been fulfilled. And so it's been interesting how empire has influenced the way people have tried to make meaning with the text. But yeah, a big concern I have today, particularly for Christians in what people label the West, is that we want to identify ourselves with the author of Revelation and with the victims of these things, but we're not on that side of things. And so we've got to find ways to frame others as our oppressors. And really, we're looking for the people, the victims of our own oppression, and trying to turn them into the oppressor. And particularly here in the U.S., we had we have shootings every day, but we had a shooting in Florida where a man who had a swastika scratched into his gun and one of the Rhodesian flag things on his clothing, who had ranted about how much he hated black people in the past, killed 3 black folks in a little market. And a bunch of the right started getting upset that this was being blamed on racism and actually trying to play the victim.
Jeez, you can't even
of this. Yeah.
You can't even shoot 3 black people without being called a racist, can you? I mean, this is wokeism gone mad.
Exactly. And they're trying to play the victim of wokeism in the wake of the murder of 3 totally innocent people in a store. And I think that shares a lot. I think that's the same thing that's going on in attempts to find ourselves as the victims in the scriptures. If we're the victims, we need an oppressor. And unfortunately, we're identifying people we're oppressing as the oppressor, which is just so asinine.
And it's incredible. I mean, I've got friends who... or acquaintances is probably a better word. But people I know who they go to church every Sunday. They, always want to have conversations with me about the Bible, about God, about Christianity. But they seem to be interested in it mostly as a cultural identifier.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Rather than sort of actually taking anything that Jesus says in those scriptures with any ounce of seriousness, or it's beyond Jesus, right? Like you look all through the Bible, and yes, there are different sort of streams of thought and so on, but a very, very strong stream is that you look after the orphan, the stranger, the oppressed. And now I've got people who, I know a guy who stood to be an MP for UKIP, right? And yet he went to church every Sunday, always wanted to have conversations about Christianity. And I just find that so confusing. It's like, what Bible are you reading?
One of the things that within the broader study of religion, and particularly the cognitive science of religion, there's this conventional wisdom that I think is fairly accurate, that our concept of religion is something that was created between the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. And it was created as a way to kind of decouple and disentangle religion from the state, and in doing so created these two different dimensions that for the longest time were one and the same. And that's not to say that's the way it's supposed to be or the way it should be, but the constituent elements of what we group together under this label religion have always been just kind of undergirding all social interaction and identities and things like that. And so to try to say that we've got to keep these things disentangled and decoupled is kind of trying to swim against the tide of human cognition. And so it's perfectly natural for folks who identify strongly with an identity like Christianity to kind of use all of the space that they want to use intuitively, which is going to go into the cultural side. And for a lot of people, the cultural side is more important than what we would say today, the religious side. And so I think that's perfectly natural. It's problematic, but it's not a huge surprise. And so that's absolutely the case here in the U.S., where we've recently had folks on Fox News saying that the left is talking about this Jesus who sounds too woke and too weak. And it's like they're quoting the Bible. And so they're literally rejecting the Jesus we see in the New Testament because that undermines their attempts to structure power and values in favor of their right-wing authoritarian identity politics, which is what makes being a Christian most meaningful for them, is the structuring of power. We have a lot of people on Twitter here in the U.S. who are talking about, they've got this masculine notion of Christianity that is very much appealing to the Crusades and that kind of crusader worldview, because that's what makes it meaningful and useful to them, that little dimension of being Christian. And the other stuff about the poor and the needy and the orphan and the widow and all that kind of stuff is, that's weak, that's woke. That's not the Christianity that they know.
That's feminine, right?
Oh, yeah, feminine as well, yeah.
You see it in a nutshell with Mark Driscoll, who's the disgraced former pastor of Mars Hill Church.
Brackets, not the Rob Bell one, right? You got
to disgraced for a different reason. He basically said, I wouldn't worship a Jesus who couldn't beat me up. Right? And I'm like, what? There's all sorts going in that. Like,
And even if you go look in Revelation, it's like, well, the Jesus there overcame or was victorious through sacrifice. This is the lamb that was slain. That is how the Jesus of Revelation achieved victory. And, there's also the bathing the sword in the blood of the victims side of it. But they're trying to, and it's something that everybody kind of intuitively does, is remake their deity in their own image, or in an image that is going to make it more meaningful and more useful to them. And because their priorities are those power structures and that right-wing authoritarianism, that's going to govern the way that they construct their concept of Jesus, which, that can't be reasoned with. You can't reason with it with that kind of dogmatism.
I think that leads us nicely, actually, onto my promise of talking about univocality, because obviously, that is what you're talking about there, is that there is only room in this certain interpretation of the Bible for one story about Christianity and about who Jesus is. And one of the big kind of themes, I guess, on your podcast is pushing against the idea of univocality in the Bible. So do you want to talk us through that a little bit?
So univocality, I think, is probably one of the most widespread dogmas regarding the Bible. And I call it a dogma because it's not something that's supported by any data. It is just something that is asserted by those in positions of authority, and it's just something you just decide to accept because the data don't point in that direction. But this is basically the idea that the Bible, whatever passage you're in, it all speaks with one single unified and consistent voice, or from one single consistent and unified perspective, meaning the text can't disagree with each other. And we see this in attempts to say, oh, this passage over here says this, that means X. And somebody's saying, well, no, because if we look at this other passage over here, that means it can't mean X. And it's like, well, those are two different passages written in two different languages by two different authors separated by multiple centuries, writing to different audiences for different reasons. And so to suggest that one governs how we interpret the other is just pure and utter nonsense.
I think actually, Dan, you'll find that the Bible was written by God. And therefore it's all written in the now King's original English.
Yeah. You hear that if the King James Version was good enough for Jesus quote a lot.
I have seen that, yeah.
I've tried to trace that back to the original, who was the first person who said that and what precisely was the context. And I don't remember if I ever got back to the original, but I think it was something like if the King James Version was good enough for Paul, I think was the earliest thing. But, yeah.
I'm not even going to ask any questions about it. I was going to be like, do they know who King James? No, they don't even know who Paul is, do they? Really?
Yeah, it's best not to think about it. But that's another dogma. The concern here is that if you say we're not going to allow anything to influence our interpretation, if it is something that must be just arbitrarily accepted or accepted because of authority, we are only going to pursue interpretation that is supported by the data or by logic and reason, what is most reasonable, most likely, most plausible. If we limit our interrogation of the text to the data, then univocality is out the window. It has absolutely no bearing on how we interpret things, which means different authors writing different texts in different time periods, whether they're a part of the same book or even the same chapter in a given book within the Bible, we have to allow for the possibility and even the probability in many cases that they just disagree with each other. And I think this opens up the book and makes it so much more fascinating, so much more interesting and complex, and also so much more utilitarian, so much more useful, because we have a lot more to grapple with, and we have a lot more that could be applicable to the questions or the concerns that we're bringing to the text.
But it's scary, isn't it? You know, like it is.
Because
like you end up, I mean, I remember, and I know this is a lot of people say this, but I think they say it because it's true. You know, when I went to uni, when I went to Exeter and did my bachelor's there, it was a very small department, the theology and religion department. I think there were probably like 40 odd people in my intake, and a significant number of them, when we first went there, were sort of fairly conservative evangelical Christians. A significant number of those were no longer Christian by the end. And I think so much of it was because they went in and it was that classic thing of you remove one brick and the whole wall comes tumbling down, right? And that's partly why I feel quite lucky to have gone to uni a little bit later, a little bit older than most of the people in that room, is because I had already done that. I'd already deconstructed and reconstructed my own faith. And it's not to say that it was super easy or anything. Like they were totally, I mean, I was very briefly a Calvinist. I hold my hands up for about 2 weeks. But yeah, a lot of people, their faith was so built on this very rigid worldview, this very rigid idea of what the Bible was, what Christianity was, and who and what God was, that as soon as you removed one thing, the whole thing just came tumbling down.
Yeah, it's a very brittle worldview, and I think that's why it scares so many people, because they recognize how tenuous it is, and it's built on these binaries, these black and white conclusions about what God is, what the scriptures are, that themselves are kind of reactions to things and attempts to shore up boundaries and reinforce them. And because they're only there for those functions, they are not robust. They are not complex. They're not nuanced. They are very simple. And as long as anyone is able to apply the least bit of critical thinking to it, it falls to the ground. And I did not become a Christian as I was not raised within Christianity. I became one later in life. So I didn't import into that a lot of that kind of binary thinking from childhood. I was not raised with on that kind of milk, so to speak, theologically. And so I came in with eyes a lot more open. And so it was not something that was a surprise to me and not something that I found harmful to the faith that I had come into. And so I think that's probably a reason that I continue on without being hurt so much or having my faith so much undermined by the scholarship and by the data, because I just find it fascinating. And on the academic side of things, I'm willing to follow the data wherever it may lead. And yeah, there are a lot of Christians who don't have that luxury. And I feel bad because I think it is significantly limiting, and it creates for what I consider a more brittle, a more fragile, and in many ways a more juvenile faith to have to rely on these binaries just because otherwise everything falls to the ground. And if it's that weak, then I don't think it deserves to be defended so dogmatically.
Adam, you've put a really great question in the notes, which I really like. Which you've just put, what is everyone's favourite example of the Bible disagreeing with itself? Which I really like, because I think that really gets to the heart of that. You know, if univocality is a thing, then the Bible cannot disagree with itself, except even the most basically intellectually honest reading of it comes to quite a quick conclusion. You know, I've always joked that most conservative evangelicals basically don't believe the Hebrew Bible is there, because if they actually took it seriously, you kind of can't do a lot of that approach to the hermeneutics that they do. So go on. What is everyone's favorite example of the Bible disagreeing with itself?
Well, I did a video just the other day on what I consider to be one of the most fascinating contradictions in the Bible, which is the question of who killed Goliath. Because 1 Samuel 17 says it was David, but then, and it refers to Goliath as a Gittite, somebody from Gath, a Philistine, and says that the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And then we have in 2 Samuel 21:19 a reference to Goliath, the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam, being killed by some dude named Elchanan. And then in 1 Chronicles 20, verse 5, we have basically a quotation of that passage from 2 Samuel 21:19, but it's fiddled with a little bit so that Elchanan kills Lachmi, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear is like a weaver's beam. And it's very muddled. And Lachmi, one, is a Semitic name, not a Philistine name. It would mean my bread, which is not a naming convention that had any circulation in that time period. And it's very clearly just kind of slightly tweaking a handful of letters in the exilic or post-exilic period, because these letters look very similar only in the Aramaic script. So basically what happened is, we have this tradition about a dude named Elchanan killing Goliath. Whoever's putting together the David tradition swipes that story and says, oh, this was David. And then we expand on it significantly, and it becomes the foundation of David's rule. And then for whatever reason, the original version is still preserved in the text. And then later on down the road, the editors of Chronicles were like, well, this is a problem, and decided, well, we can just a little tweak here and carry the two. And okay, now it says that he killed Lachmi, the brother of Goliath. And so it has been fiddled with. But that's one that I think is pretty fascinating. But usually when people ask me for my favorite one, I will say the book of James in the New Testament, where James basically says Paul is wrong. Paul says Abraham was justified by faith, not by works. James says, now we see that Abraham was justified by works, not just his faith. James is basically quoting Paul and every time knocking his argument down and saying, nope, it's the opposite. And now Christians today have to kind of fiddle with James and say, oh, no. He's talking about how if you have faith, then the works will follow. And so they're putting the cart before the horse because they got to make them fit. And because Paul is saying the thing we need to be there, we have to reinterpret James.
Which, as beautiful as some of the stuff that Paul wrote is, James is by far and away the superior book. I'm sorry. You cannot read James 5.
Luther would not have been a fan of that. Calling James an epistle of straw and putting it in the back. And I think Luther was onto something with putting Revelation in the back and even Hebrews. But yeah, he was, that's an L. Trying to get rid of James in favor of Paul, that's an L.
Yeah, 100%.
I do think the Chronicles argument, though, I think is, because obviously that book of, well, the two books in our version of it, that, the Chronicles book is this retelling, right, of the David story, but, some significant period after the first telling of it, where it just kind of is making quite different points and is quite happy to change stuff up. And so you have, that kind of King Samuel narrative, and then you have this Chronicles narrative. And if you're going to try and harmonize those two,
good luck.
You're not going to get a lot of sleepless nights. Yeah.
Especially when it comes to the Levites and their role, which is one of the huge differences between the two.
What about you, Adam? What's your...
So my one is it's kind of a fun one. I'm not sure it counts, but I'm going to say it anyway because it makes me laugh. It's Matthew 21 verses 2-7.
Ah, the donkey.
It's wonderful. So I'll read it to you, shall I? So this is the NRSV version. So, saying to them, go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this: the Lord needs them, and he will send them immediately. This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. which has led to some wonderful, like, medieval mostly art of, like, stacked donkeys basically, and Jesus on top.
There's you see sometimes he's sitting on the taller one and the smaller one is a footstool kind of thing, but the stacked donkeys, I love to imagine him kind of doing it, being a show rider, like with holding on to both and straddling the two of them and running into town,
lasso, like
but that's a great one. And then the other two accounts just have a single colts, because Matthew is the Septuagint translation there seems to be mentioning two animals, and he's like, okay, I'll do it. What about you, Ben? What's your...
I think I'd probably go for, this again is a very classic lefty pick, but everyone just misses the fact that a bunch of the Hebrew Bible is really anti-monarchy, because obviously, particularly in the David story, isn't David great? But I mean, particularly Judges, the whole point of Judges as a book is basically, look how terrible things are without a king. And yet then you've got later stories in I think is it in Samuel or Kings, I can't remember, where God is really angry about the fact that they want to get a king. He's like, this is a stupid idea, don't do that, or if you insist, but I'm really grumpy about you getting a king. We kind of just, I don't know, almost ignore that because it doesn't quite match up. And the other one is which is a nice contradiction, I think, is that Joshua apparently does not follow through on genociding everyone in the Promised Land, like it says he was going to, which I think is probably good. Like, I'm happy about that contradiction.
It's good, but it has led to certain very conservative evangelical types arguing that if you see any Canaanites today, you should kill them.
I think it's funny, one of the reasons that the anti-monarchic tenor of a lot of the Hebrew Bible isn't recognized today, isn't in widespread circulation, is because of King James. Because the most popular Bible translation in the world, and one of the things that spurred on the production of the King James Version was the Geneva Bible, which was full of explanatory notes and marginal notes that highlighted all over the place that anti-monarchical tenor, and had a very anti-monarchical bent. And one of the rules that King James set down in the 15 rules for the translators of the King James Version was no explanatory notes, because he wanted a translation that was not going to condemn monarchy. And we even have Geneva Bible uses the word tyrant in a handful of places that were taken out, that were altered in the King James Version. And ever since then, we haven't really talked much about the fact that the Hebrew Bible is anti-monarchic in a lot of places.
It's interesting. We talked a little bit about King James when Liv Roberge was on a previous episode talking about the diggers. And my point was, as far as monarchs go, James was quite a smart one. like at least in consolidating his own power, because so many of the decisions that he took were very much about how do I keep my place, because of course he started out as the King of Scotland and then became the King of England,
and the unlikely King of England.
Yeah. And so many of the decisions that he made were often really quite smart decisions, right? Were about consolidating that power, like, you know, making sure that people saw him as the rightful king.
Yeah. And now King James is a phrase that sometimes people in certain circles hear almost every day of the week. Cemented his legacy in a lot of ways.
And yet they have no idea who he is.
And it's, I mean, one of the reasons it's cemented his legacy, of course, as well as the power stuff, is in places it's really beautifully written. It's a bad translation, but beautifully written in places, right?
But it was out of date when it was written.
Yeah, that was criticism that was published by early reviewers, that this is outdated, and it is a very conservative revision. Of a conservative revision, going back to Tyndale's translation of the New Testament and portions of the Old Testament, and then Miles Coverdale's translation of the full Bible in 1535. And so it was almost a century out of date when it was first published. It was not very popular. It wasn't until 1660 that the Geneva Bible went out of print. And then this was the one that was authorized by the king. And what's funny is it kind of the popularity and the influence of the King James Version, and particularly its English, ebbed and flowed. There were times when it was rejected as influential as an important. And then we have the surge of antiquarian interests during the Great Awakenings that lead people back to, we need these important texts of yesteryear, and the KJV is there. And so, okay, let's use the King James Version, and particularly in the Americas in the 19th century, it was the translation of choice for the American Bible Society, which had the goal of placing a Bible in every home in America. And I think one year they managed to place like 500,000 Bibles. And so that just spread it far and wide. And then it became one of the standard textbooks in the public classroom in America in the 19th century as well. So, but words like warfare had completely gone out of the English language. Nobody used that word until the Second Great Awakening. And all of a sudden, because we now are using the King James Version again, that term comes back into usage. And there are some wonderful articles about how the English language changed depending on whether the King James Version was considered valuable or not.
I think to close this out, I'd like to talk a little bit about, I guess, what do we do with all this? Because we've kind of, spent some time talking about what happens when we look at the Bible critically, which is obviously really important to do. But what do we do with what we have left? And how do we reconcile that intellectual importance of critical analysis and having the Bible as a book that has an influence on our faith?
And I think that's really important, actually, just to sort of interject there, because we are not in the business of tearing people's faiths down, right? What we want to do is, hopefully do something where we are encouraging people to engage these ideas alongside and with our faith, to inform our faith as well,
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that I've always suggested is we need to recognize that we're negotiating with the text, that we're not just the passive recipient of these messages, but that we are actively engaged in the production of what we find in the text, and being careful that what we're producing, the meaning that we are making, is aimed at a worthy end. And I think to the degree that we prioritize the strengthening of the hand of the oppressed and the poor and the orphan and the widow, I would hope that the making of meaning is productive and is moving us in the right direction. Whereas if we're making that meaning in order to structure power and values over and against the interests of the poor and the oppressed and the orphan and the widow, I would consider that a destructive use of that prerogative to make meaning with the text. When I was at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies doing my master's degree, I had a bit of what Krister Stendahl would call holy envy for the way I saw some of the Jewish scholars engaging with the text, which I think their approach is a much more mature, much more seasoned approach, where they view the text largely, it's not as a constitution, it's not as a history book, it is an invitation to wrestle with what's going on in the text in order to inform their lives, to give meaning to it, and to help them identify with the folks in the text, and to think about, am I the good guy? Am I the bad guy in these scenarios? What side of this battle am I on? And I think Christians would do well to approach the text a little more like an invitation to grapple with the details of the text, rather than as a constitution and your job is to follow the letter of the text, because that's pretty much invariably going to result in deploying it in the service of power structures, which today are primarily right-wing authoritarian power structures.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure I've said this before, but I didn't engage with the practice of regular Bible reading despite all the, social pressure of being in an evangelical church until I was a hellbound liberal when it comes to scripture. and then actually I was fascinated by those stories. But for me, there was something much more exciting and life-giving and enjoyable about reading scripture, something to be considered and thought about and wrestled with, than there was about reading it so that God could tell me directly exactly how I'm screwing up my life. It's a much...
We'll tell you that, Ben.
Yeah, exactly. I got enough of that anyway. Yeah, no, I think it is, just a much more enjoyable, as well as intellectually honest, but I find it a much more, for me, approaching the Bible this way, it feels like something that you can actually have fun reading, which I certainly did not always feel like. Yeah,
and I think for me, to sort of add to that as well, is it has opened my faith up in ways that I just never expected. One of the things it's made me kind of stop doing is looking for the devil around every corner, thinking that if I look at this or entertain this idea that might have its roots in Catholicism or something,
which is Satan's church. Yes, that's
But do you know what I mean though? Like there was a time when, I might have sort of said, oh, well, I'm not going to go to Teze because there's a few too many Catholics there. Not that I thought that Catholics were, hellbound sinners, but they were in error,
Yeah.
And I think now I'm able to, I'm not a Roman Catholic, but I'm able to draw from Catholic spirituality, for example, in ways that just would not have occurred to me before.
And I think particularly for me, Jewish spirituality, and there's this really weird thing where there's this kind of period where biblical scholarship suddenly goes, oh, I wonder if we should ask Jewish people about the Hebrew Bible. They might have some idea.
No.
Right? But it is, there's this shocking period where not all, I'm sure, but, I'm talking quite historically here, where a lot of biblical scholarship kind of thought, well, we don't want to talk to Jewish people and Jewish scholars about this stuff because they've got dangerous and wrong ideas that we don't want infecting our good Christian theology. And you're right, it's opening yourself up to these alternative influences, perhaps even influences outside of Christianity and Judaism.
Whoa.
If we're really, I think it's, you're right. And obviously the way you read the Bible impacts the way you live the rest of your Christian life, and that impacts the way, as soon as you start opening up one part, the conservative evangelicals are partially right about the slippery slope, right? Once you start opening up, how you might read scripture. It does open up more things, but I have found that process to be life-giving rather than dangerous.
Yeah. Agreed. I think what it is a threat to is boundary maintenance and those power structures. But if that's not your priority, then maybe don't be worried about that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you're right that, those hermeneutics, I mean, as Adam said, why is King James so concerned about the rules for his translation? Because the right translation of the Bible shores up his power rather than undermines it. So, I think you're totally, some people might disagree with you on Twitter, but I completely am on board with your view that the power structures are a big thing in how we consider this stuff.
Yeah. Typical Marxist.
Just that cultural Bolshevism.
Exactly. I think we will call it an episode there. Thank you very much for joining us, Dan. It has been really fascinating to have some of your insights. And yeah, I thoroughly recommend the Data Over Dogma podcast. I am not on TikTok because it confuses and scares me, but Adam tells me your TikTok is also excellent. So
Adam's
remind us where we can find you.
So I go by @McClellan across a number of different social media platforms, but it's a phonetic spelling of my last name that I used while I was living in South America. It's McClellan. And then the Data Over Dogma podcast, which I have already hopefully adequately plugged, Dan Beecher. So I better not hear anything about this.
So the what podcast? Sorry, I didn't catch that. Yeah,
I feel like on the radio they say you have to say your company's name 3 times in a row. So Data Over Dogma podcast.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, go and check that stuff out. Adam, where in the world can people find you?
You can find me most places at CommieXIAN.
And you can find this podcast in all the usual podcast feed places. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/breadandrosaries. We're on Twitter @bread_rosaries. And you can email us breadandrosaries@gmail.com. Do get in touch with us. We love to hear from people. I don't think we have a TikTok, do we, Adam?
No. Sometimes I put some clips from I put one of the Saints of the Week on there, the dog one. But
yeah, dog content. That's gonna.
Yeah, dog content always does well on TikTok.
Yeah. I do think we always start with Facebook, and I think, wow, we're such boomers at heart. Like, start with the Facebook.
But we do have a website now as well.
Oh yeah, because that's not old school at this point. A website, yeah.
But it has a shop on it, Ben.
Yeah, it does.
breadandrosaries.com.
Yeah. You were said 3 times as well, just to make sure it's
breadandrosaries.com.
Yes.
Buy our shit.
Or Adam will have no more room in his flat. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll see everyone next time. Goodbye.
See you later.